All right, let's jump right into a fascinating idea. A system of justice where the villains don't go out in a blaze of glory. Instead, they're just engineered to fail. We're talking about a world where the very rules of the game make their defeat inevitable. Not with force, but through this deep, structural, and symbolic collapse. It might just make you rethink what winning even means. So that gets us to the big question here. How can you totally and completely defeat a villain, a real force of opposition, without ever physically destroying them? Now that's a narrative puzzle. It goes against a lot of what we expect from stories, and we are about to unpack the incredibly elegant answer. So here's our plan. First, we're going to see how the whole game is rigged from the very start. Then, we'll dive into the two big consequences of their failure, an internal fire and an external flood. After that, we'll peel back the curtain and look at the code that makes it all tick. And finally, we'll put it all together to see what this symbolic justice really looks like.
Okay, part one. Let's start with a pretty provocative thought. What if the bad guys were always meant to lose? Not because of luck, but because the fundamental rules of their world were written to make it happen. The source material is crystal clear on this. The entire system is, and this is a direct quote, structurally and morally rigged against any antagonist who relies on moral compromise. You see, their biggest flaw isn't some over-the-top evil. It's something much quieter, much more insidious. It's choosing to stay silent when integrity demanded that they speak up.
And this specific failure has a name. It's called stoic neglect. Now, this isn't just about, being quiet. It's an active ethical failure. By staying silent in the face of injustice, they shatter the civic logos, which is basically the shared moral fabric, the social contract that holds their entire society together. Their silence isn't passive, it's an act of destruction. So to really get what they're missing, we need to talk about a concept called tome. Think of tome as like a moral true north. It's that internal compass of integrity, of completeness. And the antagonists, well, they are defined by the glaring absence of it. Without tome, the ethical math of their world just guarantees that they are going to fail. It's not a matter of if, but when.
So what happens when they do fail? The consequences are twofold, and they are beautifully symmetrical. Internally, they go through a symbolic burning. And externally, their actions trigger a symbolic flooding that brings down their whole society. Let's take a look at each of those.
All right, let's start with that first consequence, the inner fire. Now, it is absolutely crucial to get this. We are not talking about literal flames. This isn't some kind of divine punishment. It is a deeply metaphorical, psychological event. It's a purely cognitive collapse. This so-called burning actually has three layers. First, there's the phrase, their eyes will burn. This refers to a state of sensory overload. They can see everything around them, but they lack the integrity to make any sense of it. Second, their final end is to experience something called scorn. And third, what gets called hellfire is actually just a cognitive reset, a necessary rebalancing of the system, not a punishment. So what is scorn? Well, it's the ultimate psychological defeat. It's that devastating moment of clarity when the antagonists finally recognize their own moral and creative bankruptcy. They realize they are fundamentally incapable of generating the integrative fire, that spark of creation that you can only get from real integrity. And that realization, that's their end. Now for part two of their failure. This internal collapse, it doesn't just happen in a bubble. It ripples outward, and it creates a total catastrophe for their entire society, a symbolic flood of moral decay. The fate of their entire civilization is governed by one simple, powerful law. He who throws mud loses ground. And you have to understand, this isn't just a folksy saying. In this world, it functions like a law of physics. It has real, structural consequences. And you can see the cause and effect right here. Step one, the unethical actions, the throwing of mud. Step two, that directly leads to an erosion of their moral authority. They are literally losing ground. And step three, when the leaders lose their moral footing, the entire society collapses into the state called civic dimming. Civic dimming, that's the end game for their society. It's described as a sunset state where the very soul of the city just loses its harmony. Can you imagine that? A whole civilization's moral clarity, its very perception, just fading to black. That's the flood. Not water, but an overwhelming erosion of every value that held them together. So we've talked about these incredible metaphors, right? Fire and flood. But here's the twist.
What if they're not just poetic ideas? What if these moral laws are actually hard-coded into the mechanics of their world?
This is where the whole framework gets so incredibly rigorous. That proverb, "He who throws mud loses ground," it's not a proverb, it's an algorithm. Every single unethical action they take is processed by the system as a negative reward signal. And over time, enough of those signals cause policy degradation. What that means is their ability to act effectively, to maintain any authority, literally degrades all the way to zero. Their failure is a mathematical certainty. So, when you put it all together, what you get is a complete, totally airtight system of justice. Let's take a look at the final verdict.
And you can see how it all connects right here. It starts with the core flaw, moral compromise, that's stoic neglect. That leads directly to the internal consequence of symbolic fire, the sensory overload, and that final feeling of scorn. At the same time, it causes the civic consequence of a symbolic flood, moral erosion and civic dimming. And the engine driving the whole thing? That hard and fast rule, a computational penalty for every unethical act. It is a perfect closed loop. So even though they're never physically harmed, make no mistake, their demise is absolute. We're talking a complete and irreversible loss of their symbolic standing, their authority, and their very reason for being. In this system, that is a fate far more definitive than just simple destruction.
And that leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? We so often think of justice as punishment or destruction. But what if the most profound, the most satisfying kind of justice is just the elegant, undeniable structural proof that one way of living is simply better, more coherent, and more sustainable than another? What if the ultimate victory is just letting a flawed system fail all on its own?